Hello and welcome to asiCast number 166. I'm Richard Marks, ASI's Research Director. Now, Mike Sainsbury and I have been enjoying Evan Shapiro's recent articles and posts on all things media. I think many of you may have seen the media map of the world, which he created for Deadline and has cropped up all over the internet. We'll put a link in the show notes just in case you haven't. Evan charts media's future through his essays on the Media War and Peace newsletter and with his change agency, eShap. His background before that is in TV production, including a favourite show of mine, Portlandia. So welcome to the show, Evan.
Thanks so much.
Now, Evan, what prompted us to invite you onto this pod specifically was a recent column of yours, What's in a Name, which we particularly enjoyed as it focused on a topic that's very close to our hearts at ASI, which is the importance of using media terminology correctly, or at least understanding what it means. You've described yourself as a media cartographer, so I guess it must be quite hard to map the territory if the destinations and place names aren't labelled properly. Was there a particular flashpoint that inspired you to write about the misuse of language?
Yes, I mean, I've been asked to speak a great deal lately about something called FAST, free ad-supported streaming television. And then, I at these conferences, you hear terminologies bandied about, such as FAST or AVOD or SVOD or OTT. And what winds up happening, especially at a conference like IBC or any, I was at Royal Television Society, right, immediately after that, you hear people kind of use competing terminology or nomenclature, and then just confusion ensues. And the confusion creates ambiguity, ambiguity creates anxiety, anxiety creates, frankly, a tremendous amount of stasis. And in order to make progress, it's Tower of Babel. This is a very old story. If people can't communicate correctly with each other, it's very difficult for them to find agreement. And if you can't find agreement, it's almost impossible to make progress. And so my hope is by demystifying the language we use and creating, hopefully, a common language for the culture of media, we can find our way through the current tumult that the media ecosystem is facing.
Yeah, I think the Tower of Babel is a very good analogy for what is going on at the moment. I think one of the words you highlight that is often misused or being generous, misunderstood is linear. How would you use that word, and when wouldn't you use that word?
Well, I think linear is something that is curated by someone else that isn't on demand. So it's a chronological definition, regardless of whether it's streaming or on broadcast or on audio, frankly. If the user can't disintermediate or interrupt the flow of content, then it is linear. If it is completely at the choice or whim of the consumer, well, then it is very, very basically, by its own definition, on demand. And actually, one of the inspirations for that piece that you mentioned was this complete misinterpretation of the information by Nielsen of their own data. They put out this breathless press release that streaming had surpassed linear as a use case in the television ecosystem based on data that they had gotten. I think it was July's or August's gauge that they put out. This is obviously in the United States. And what's wrong about that is that is just, it's just a complete misrepresentation of the facts. Because when you look at the amount of linear, whether it's on broadcast or on streaming, there is good amount of linear usage on both. There is also a good amount of on-demand usage on both. And so the idea that you would call linear superior to streaming is just, it's just factually incorrect. There's a tremendous amount of linear viewing, FAST, being one of those elements. But also in the United States, we have YouTube TV and Hulu Live and Spectrum Reach, which are these cable systems that stream.
Mm.
And so those two are linear. And so it is, and it creates, and then what was equally frustrating to me, to be blunt, was Nielsen put out this press release that said this headline, and then literally every trade who professes to be reporting on our industry just cut and paste it. They didn't ask the question. They didn't push on the details at all, at all. And so that became the story of the day. And it's how an industry all goes blind simultaneously, is they just follow the leader without questioning it, and you wind up in a cul-de-sac without an exit.
Yeah, that you've highlighted one of my particular bugbears, which is that people tend, accidentally or deliberately, we can discuss that later on, to confuse content with the delivery of content.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
but saying moving from linear to streaming is like saying you're moving from cars to roads. You're switching between two
Precisely.
totally different things. And as we know, I mean, one of the big movements in streaming at the moment is for a lot of the global companies to be bidding for sports rights. And if
Mm-hmm.
sports isn't linear, then God knows what isn't. So I knew I'd work your T-shirt into the conversation.
Well, there you go. I mean, and yeah, that's the thing is, I yesterday spent all day streaming live sports. Is that linear? Of course it is. I can't stop the game and make it go in a different order, or I guess I could hit pause, but it's still linear. And so, whether it's cricket in India or football in the UK or baseball in the United States, streaming sports is going to become one of the key elements of rights and consumption, consumer video consumption for the next, certainly the next number of years. The prices being paid for them are astronomical. And one of the key benefits and attributes that rights buyers are getting out of sports is that it is linear on streaming, is that it is live, is that it is urgent, and is that it is not being disintermediated by the consumer via the principle of time.
Yeah, it's a really key point in terms of trying. I think one of the challenges is that a lot of articles, a lot of press releases, a lot of observers are trying to understand a direction of travel, from somewhere to somewhere, when often where you end up is actually a balance between the two. It's not necessarily moving from linear to VOD, but working out what the optimum balance is between those things. I guess one obvious direction of travel is from broadcast to streaming as a means of delivery, given that some observers predict that broadcast may be switched off at some point in the last 20 years. So I guess would you say that's arguably a more valid way of looking at things?
It is to a certain extent, but when the BBC becomes an entirely streamed product, which they've said that they will be in, let's say by the end of this decade, is it no longer broadcast, even though it is a publicly mandated service? I think we can kind of probably eventually drop that terminology in favor of streaming. But then, if everything is streaming, why do we need a definition around streaming itself? It's all delivered. It's kind of like saying phone versus cellular. To use a kind of extension of the metaphor you brought up earlier. But I think you bring into it a larger point, which is I think so much of leadership in media writ large is so focused on the dichotomy or the binary set of choices, as opposed to a much more nuanced and frankly more complicated set of behaviors and processes and inputs and outputs to define. It's not always going to be easy to define, and therefore you have to really get your head around and become much more comfortable with several choices, or a non-binary set of choices, because at the end of the day, the consumer, we've ceded all of the control of the media ecosystem to the consumer. They now program their media suite on their phones with their thumbs at a whim. And if you're not prepared to adapt, I mean, I would take it a step further and break down the barriers between video and audio, between gaming and television, not necessarily in a moment's notice, but in an experience. The consumers are using the same screen to leap between these genres, or these platforms, elegantly within seconds. And I think the desire of leadership to keep the silos solid is one of the key challenges that we've inflicted on ourselves, frankly.
Well, I mean, arguably we're a good example of that, in that some of the people listening to you will be listening to the audio version, some will be watching the video version of the content, depending on what stage of the day they're at or what their preference is. I mean, I remember doing work for the BBC ages ago, where they were tracking people's attention, and I think it was only at around about 5 o'clock in the afternoon that more people were watching television than listening to it, having it on in the background. So it's a I think there's another sort of predecessor of this debate is actually the whole issue around the use of the word digital, which does persist to this day. You will see people talking about ad revenue shifting from television to digital, which will have the TV trade bodies bouncing up and down saying, well, what about digital television? Where does that fit? But again,
right. I mean, connected television is now the #1 video platform on the face of the earth. And, regardless of how the signal got to the home, the second it goes through a connected television in the home, it is digital, isn't it? I don't even use channels really much anymore, as much as I use apps. And I think you have to at some point abandon the things that make you feel safe in order to grow up. And we're not at that moment. We've passed that moment. The rigor mortis that we're seeing kicking around traditional, especially American media, is really disconcerting to me. We passed the Rubicon in 2019 when Disney Plus launched their service and took up 10 million subscribers in the first month. That is the moment when everything really changed forever. It's just that for the most part, the mainstream big media ecosystem failed to realize it. And it was at that moment that big media, traditional media, ceded basically everything to big tech. And on one hand, that seems dangerous and kind of, I think, a little scary to everybody, but it doesn't change the reality that if you want to reach the consumers that matter most to you anywhere on the planet Earth, you're going to have to go through one of 4 or 5 big tech Death Stars to get there, whether that's on a phone or a connected television or however you get there. And so, the second you accept the new reality that you're living in, you can adapt to it, and then, to a certain extent, take advantage of it. As much as Apple and Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Nvidia and Samsung control the pathway to the consumer, none of them are going to be able to succeed long term without the publishers that are the lifeblood. To your point, there is a difference between content and delivery. And as much as Google does practice in content here and there, and Amazon makes shows and Apple's making shows, at the end of the day, they're tech companies. And they rely on publishers and are going to absolutely, especially in Europe, they're completely dependent on firms like the BBC and RDF and ZDF and France Television, because those are public service media and they're not going anywhere. The second that public service media and all the major publishers of the planet realize that they both have to work with and compete against these big tech Death Stars, then they can start to balance their operations around the ecosystem that we have, not the one that they miss.
Mhm. I think a great example of that, and I'm not having a go at all journalists, some of them do manage to figure it out, but is the interchangeability of the word television itself. The television, the medium available on anything with a screen and an internet device, compared to TV, the TV set, often leads to a lot of confusion. I know it's a particular bugbear of those working television, that often an article in the trade press about television will be accompanied by an old-fashioned 1950s TV with an aerial on top. To which their comment will be, but TVs don't look like that anymore. But the question is, what do TVs look like? How can you? Yeah, it does. Television is named after the device that served it, in much the same way as podcasts are named after a device which no longer exists.
Yeah. And half of podcast listening happens on YouTube. I think the first time I wrote about that conundrum, television, the device versus television, the experience, was, I think, 10 years ago. And back then I wrote a sentence that was something around, and I'm paraphrasing myself here, but it was something constructed somewhere around the idea of television is no longer a box or a device. It is an experience. It's a relationship between a storyteller and an audience. And that, I think, remains to be true. It's the same way an article has nothing to do with a magazine. You can read an article on your phone just as easily as you can read it in a printed piece of paper. And so, we and I think part of the challenge that we're facing right now is that the people running, not all, but a good portion of the most powerful media companies on earth, have kind of completely lost the thread of storytelling as the main point. And that thus the massive strikes that have happened in the United States and have completely disrupted, the entertainment ecosystem over the last half year. There is this, back from the days of old school radio through today, a good story told over a series of chapters. I'm in the process of watching an excellent television show called Drops of God on Apple TV, and it's a very well crafted story that could have very easily been written 25 years ago, 50 years ago, because it's about the lineage of a wine family, and the historical sense memory of two different families, one from Japan and one from France. It is as old as time itself. I don't give a shit where I'm watching it, honestly. I just love that there's this process of very patient storytelling being employed by the craftspeople who made it. And it happens to be that I'm watching it on a device called a connected television, but it is very much TV.
And is that being released on a weekly basis, or did it all dump down at the same time as a box set? Do you remember? Or
I believe this one was entirely dropped at once, but I could be wrong about that because I'm now watching it after it's been around for a while. But I also very much enjoyed the patience it took to watch a number of different shows that I've been watching. Mayor of Easttown is a really good example of that. Euphoria, and these are both HBO shows, but the idea that I have to wait, like that I think, my family recently was like, "Can't we watch the whole thing?" I'm like, I don't actually want to watch the whole thing. I want my brain to take a break and actually sit inside the story for a couple of days in between chapters, because boy, oh boy, I feel like I'm missing important nuances when I just cram it all down my throat. It's like eating a cheeseburger in 2 bites.
well, one of the reasons I mentioned that, the episode drop specifically, was that you do highlight in the article the arguably the increased redundancy of some of the acronyms we're using, like SVOD, AVOD, TVOD, etc., in terms of the walls are breaking down between those particular types. With Netflix having advertising, with um, you know, VOD services having linear. Also, I do remember, I think you may have been involved in an episode of Portlandia where the main characters binge Battlestar Galactica solidly
Yeah.
for which I used about 10 times for conferences at the time when I was getting across the idea of binge watching. Of course, Netflix came on the back of that whole concept of the DVD box set, but now very much the norm is to be downloading episodes certainly on Apple TV and Disney Plus weekly. In other words, much like the broadcast model. So there is this tendency that the silos that we're defining media by are themselves breaking down, making it harder to say you are that, you fit into that category.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. I think, most of the acronyms are created by experts who have an agenda of profit for themselves in creating the acronyms in the first place. I'm going to drop a piece later today about the danger of the expert economy, and the I think supreme confidence of a untransparent expert, based on their desire to retain power by being an expert themselves. And I think that's part of the trap that we as an industry put ourselves in. And so I think it's crucial that we become a little bit more comfortable with ambiguity. There's a unfortunately a war starting in the Middle East right now, and everybody wants to decamp to black and white positions on the board. And unfortunately, that's just not a luxury we have anymore. There are several different things at play in almost every circumstance that if you don't know the full spectrum of what's going on behind the scenes, you're very much at risk of falling into a trap that someone else has set for you. And specifically in the media ecosystem right now, there is this confirmation bias amongst media writers, amongst media analysts, that is completely untransparent. Their access to certain powerful people is the currency by which they operate their businesses. And they don't necessarily talk about that when they are talking about the industry in a way that influences other people's behavior. And that's really, really dangerous. It is actually a large part of why we are where we are right now, is this set of traps we continually set for each other, and our lack of honesty with each other about the agendas we carry into every conversation.
Yeah, it's certainly something the BBC has had to contend with for the last multiple decades, is the reporting of them by media that has a vested interest in their failure.
Correct.
So the other aspect that I think sometimes feeds into our debate about names and perhaps the motivation behind how we describe things is this increasing tendency, you touched on it just then, for everything having to be binary. The irony is that digital inverted commas brought us the internet, and the internet seemed to bring with it the idea that everything has to be binary, good or right, bad or good, thumbs up or thumbs down on everything. And the ability that two things can coexist and both be true seems to be increasingly hard for people to understand.
That's exactly right. We're all so wrapped up in being right all the time that we're not ever prepared to admit when we're wrong. But two people can be equally right and equally wrong at the same time as well. It is not a binary set of choices. Most of the world is no longer a binary set of choices. As much as the American political system would like you to believe that, it is very much just shades of gray, and that feels, I think, very uncomfortable, especially for people over a certain age. Unfortunately, people over a certain age don't seem to necessarily want to include opinions of those who are more comfortable with ambiguity, people under a certain age. And so that is another, wisdom doesn't necessarily always come with age. Experience doesn't always predict, success. Sometimes the best ideas come from the most unexpected places. And we should be right now in a competition of the best ideas, not the loudest voices. And unfortunately, I feel like too much of our industry veers towards the latter and not the former.
I mean, it's been fascinating talking about this. We could do a whole series on it. But do you think, as a final thought, there's any chance that we might, given what you've been saying, actually arrive at any consistency? I know Mike and I, it's often mentioned ASI is at the heart of the international media community, and people often come to us and say, can you do a dictionary, a defining word, so we can actually all agree that this word means this? We know what an impression is, we know what an impact is. Do you think that is an achievable goal, or is actually the politics, and I guess also the language translations, because bear in mind a lot of markets are then have got the additional stage of translating an English phrase into their local languages. Do you think that consistency is possible, or is it just something we've got to live at and try and deal with as much as we can?
I think it is. I think in order to get to a level of shared language and consistent terminology and consistent kind of thinking across our ecosystem, we have to be able to come together, though, and have a conversation where everyone is listening before they're talking, and everyone's talking with each other, not at each other. And that to me is the major blocker. If ASI or other organizations had a convening of individuals who came not because they had an agenda, but because they were proven to have a curiosity around the topic, then I do think there's a capability of sitting down and having a reasonable conversation about what we should call things, why, and how we change those things when it's necessary. I mean, Merriam-Webster, adds words to the dictionary every year. Every year they add a slew of words to the dictionary. And I don't see a lot of people yelling at them when they do that. You know what I mean? It's kind of an accepted thing that each year they're going to put out a list of new words that they've added to the English language that are totally okay. And I think that is something that can be done, but we all have to kind of agree to agree and agree to disagree, and then be able to make progress as a result of decisions being made. But right now, I think too much of the world is frankly incentivized to yell at each other, as opposed to talk with each other. And that to me is something that needs to be solved first.
That sounds like a really good upbeat point to end on, hopefully, that we can talk to each other. We'll put links to the articles we've been talking about in the show notes so people can follow up, and I look forward to reading the article you're working on today. But in the meantime, thanks for taking time out to speak to us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.